Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to be covering CSS Grid as a layout tool. I'm especially going to be focusing on the sort of core properties and core behaviors of Grid, and as opposed to showing you just practical applications of a specific practical application of Grid. So in the future instructors might make videos or resources to show you how to use Grid to create a nav bar. But this video is going to be focused more on, again, the core properties and the core behaviors, so you get a good foundation for what Grid is and how it works. And it will be, as I said, a somewhat longer video, so get comfortable. So what is CSS Grid? CSS Grid is a layout tool that was released, quote unquote, in 2017 and has been in development for quite some time. And it's very popular. Before Grid, web developers really had no good tools for controlling where elements are positioned on the page. In the past, people were using various properties like float, or even in further back tables, HTML tables, to control where elements appear on the page. But float was never really designed for that purpose. It was never meant to be a general layout tool. And it causes all kinds of headaches when you try to use it that way. So CSS Grid was created to give people much more control over how a web page looks and where elements go, and how big they are, how wide they are, and just to give a lot of control over especially how to use the horizontal space or the width of a page in ways that we couldn't before. So in these days, it's very important to learn Grid because that's how people make websites now. So let me just get you acquainted with the code that I've got here. It's pretty simple. Just have a basic HTML file, and I've got in my body just a section element that I called grid container. And then I've got 10 paragraphs, 10 paragraphs that I've numbered here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I type their numbers into the contents of the paragraph elements. And I've also given them a class name. So like the first paragraph I called 1, the second paragraph I called 2, just so it's very clear which paragraph I'm referring to in this video. So that's it. That's the HTML. I've linked to a CSS file. And nothing too special here. I just changed the font and got rid of some margins. For the paragraphs, I gave it, I made the text white, gave it some padding and a border, and then I have made the color sky blue, the sort of light blue. The only other fancy thing that I'm doing, this looks so fancy, but it's actually quite simple. This just grabs every even numbered paragraph and makes it this dark blue color, just to give a little visual variety here. Okay, so that's my code. Now I'm going to show you CSS Grid. So the first thing we do is we want to grab the grid container. So when you use Grid, you are going to have this kind of setup where you have a parent element, and usually this is referred to as the grid container, sometimes the main grid. And then we have a bunch of what are called grid items. So the children of this element are called grid items. So in order to activate Grid, we grab the container in our CSS. And we set display grid. And nothing visually happens on the page, but all of a sudden we have access to a lot of powerful grid properties that will help us with our layout. So by default, Grid will do what normal document flow does. For every new item, for every grid item, it will create a row for that item. And that row will be 100% of the width of the page. And the height will be just whatever the height of the element is, when you take into account the padding and the font and the border and such. So we can actually change that with the grid auto flow property. By default, it's set to row. We can change it to be default set to column. And so what it will do is it'll create, instead of creating a new row for every grid item, it'll create a new column for every grid item. In practice, most people like to keep it at row, but I just wanted to show you that this is a a tool that you do have. Okay, so the second property I want to show you is grid template columns. So this property lets you set how many columns you want and how wide you want those columns to be. So let's just start with, I want a column that's 100 pixels wide. And if I wanted to add more columns, I would just add more values. So 200 pixels wide, let's do 400 pixels wide. Okay, and so you can see I've given 3 values, and so I've got 3 columns, and the width of each column is the value or the number of pixels that I put into it. So it's that easy to create a multi-column format grid. It's just literally really just 2 lines: display grid and grid template columns. In practice, though, I think people tend not to use pixels for this. So what people will use is a new notation that's specific to grid called FR. FR stands for fraction. So let me just show you. I think this is easiest to show. So I'll make a 2-column grid. So again, 2 values. So we got 2 columns. And what I've done here is I've created 2 columns where the second column is twice as big as the first column. And you can see that visually on the screen. So the way this works is grid will take 100% of the width of the page, and it'll see that I've got, it'll add up my fractions. It'll see that I've got 2 plus 3, or sorry, 2 plus 1 equals 3. And it'll see that I want the first fraction to be given to the first column, and then the other 2 fractions to be given to the second column, creating this appearance of the second column being twice as big as the first. So, and you can sort of add more. I could do like 3FR, 1FR, 2FR. But the point is that, the point that I want to make here is that it's always using 100% of the width of the page. So if my screen size were to grow or to shrink, you can see that the columns will adjust themselves and will still be in that 3FR to 1FR, 2FR ratio with each other. So I can make it quite small. I can make it really wide. So this is amazing because, you know, this is so easy to create something that that looks good for mobile screens and on larger screens. It's that easy. And you could also very easily imagine creating just a very simple page just using the grid template columns. Like here, we have a multi-column format, right? Or the start of a multi-column format. Okay, so that's grid template columns. There's also one called grid template rows. And it does a similar thing with some slight differences. So let's start with pixels. I might add a row that is 100 pixels tall instead of wide. This refers to height instead of width. So 100 pixels tall, and then a second row that is 200 pixels tall. And it gives you that. But in practice, people will often use, again, the fraction notation. So they might do like 1FR, 3FR, 2FR. So this works a little differently. So let me see, okay. The 1FR in a row refers to the height of the smallest element. So the smallest element that we have, if we just take all this out, actually they're all the same height. So they're all the smallest element. But the smallest element, let's say this is the smallest element. The height of this element is just the height of the content, so the 16-point font, plus the height of the padding I've got here, so 10 on the top, 10 on the bottom, plus the height of the border, just 1 pixel on the top, 1 pixel on the bottom. So how many pixels that adds up to, that is what 1FR refers to. So if I wanted to add more columns, so I have 1FR, 3FR, 2FR, the height of the second row is going to be 3 times as tall as the height of the smallest row. And the height of the third row will be 2 times as tall as the height of the first row. So when you're dealing with grid template rows, it sort of bases itself around the height of the smallest row. That's what 1FR is. Whereas, and it doesn't use necessarily all of the height of the page. And that's different than grid template columns, because grid template columns will use like all of the width of the page, and it will try to proportion out that width depending on how many rows you have and what value you've given them. So that's just one way that columns and rows work a little differently in grid. Just something to note. Okay, so that's grid template rows, and we can add space between our grid items with the grid gap property. So let's just give it a maybe 5 pixels. And this works kind of similarly to margin, except only it doesn't add it all around the element. It just adds it in between the grid items. So this creates a 5 pixel gutter. This is called a gutter between our elements. I like to add a grid gap. I think it just makes it look nice. Okay, so let me just switch this back to 2 rows to show you this next property. So you might be noticing, you might be saying, Thomas, you've given it 3 columns and you've given it 2 rows, but there are more than 2 rows. There are actually 4 rows here. So what's happening is, let me give you some vocabulary. The instructions that I've given with these 2 properties, these are called the explicit grid. So I've explicitly commanded the browser to create 3 columns, and I've explicitly commanded the browser to create 2 columns, right? And I've given it, I've told it how wide or tall I want those columns and rows to be. But there's extra content that doesn't fit into just that 2x3 grid. We've got 4 extra grid items. So what it will do is it will create implicit rows. It'll add more rows, and it'll match the column instructions that I've given it until it runs out of content. So these 6 boxes here that I've created with the grid template columns and grid template rows, that is the explicit grid. And then anything that's sort of automatically created because it has more content than will fit into that grid, that's called the implicit grid, or I like to think of it as the automatically created grid. And we can actually adjust how tall any automatically created rows are with the grid auto rows property. So I might say I want any automatically created row to be 250 pixels. And then it'll be 250 pixels. Yeah, so it always looks a little weird to me because I zoom in quite a bit so that people can visually see it. But yeah, sorry. There's a lot of space for 250 pixels. But yeah, so you can set how tall any automatically created rows are with the grid auto rows property, and you can also use like the ifr notation. So we can just say that we want any automatically created rows to be twice as big as the height of the smallest row. For now, I'll just set it to 1FR. Okay. That is, I guess, the first chunk of grid. So if you were, if let's say that, excuse me. So how would you use these properties? In practice, I would say that the most commonly used properties that I see with grid are just display grid and grid template columns. You could do so much with just those 2 properties. So like imagine if you wanted to have a multi-column format where you've got like 2 small asides on the right and the left, and then a main contents area in the middle, then you just create a grid with a parent container, and then you add your 3 grid items, your boxes, like one aside, a second aside, and then a main content grid item, and then you create a 3-column format just like this, and it's so easy. Or let's say that you have a nav bar, and the nav bar has like 4 to 5 buttons, and you want them to be evenly spaced in the space you've given it, right? Then you can just create a grid, and each button can be a grid item, and you give it 5 columns, and just like that, you've got a well-organized nav bar. So you can use grid template columns for as a general layout tool, or you can use it for small parts of your website, just to organize how elements use their width, right? It sort of kind of replaces float, and is much more easier to use than float in a lot of ways. So that's the most common way of using these properties. Another, I would say you would use grid auto rows, and you'd want to get comfortable with grid template rows and grid auto rows. If you, let's say you had a lot of, you're building a website for an artist who wants to showcase a lot of work, or you were building a website for a restaurant that has a lot of menu items, right? So you're going to have a lot of images and a lot of just chunked items, right? So you'd want to get good at using the grid auto rows and the grid template rows properties to sort of organize all that content and to make it in a neat, you create a neat layout that, so that, if you happen to add more images later, well, it can handle that, right? You don't have to like completely rearrange how you're organizing the page the way you would with float. So that's how I'd use these. And if anything, if you just want to learn the bare minimum with grid, I would say learn about this parent container and having grid items, and then learn just how to use the grid template columns property, because it does so much. Okay, so now let's say I want to take one of my grid items and move it around the page. There are tools for that. So if you recall, in my HTML, I've got 10 grid items, and I've given each one a class name that matches, its number. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab the first item. So this is paragraph, grid item 1, the paragraph 1. And I'm going to use the grid column property. And so I'll just show you. This property basically allows me to control where it is on the page. So let me show you. Let's say I do 2, 3. Okay, so it moved. What did it do? What did I do? So when we set display grid, we are actually creating a grid, like with vertical and horizontal lines. So let me just sort of show you the grid with my mouse where the grid is. Grid column line 1, the browser sees grid column line 1 as running down the left side of the page. And then grid column line 2 runs in between, in this little gutter here. This is grid column line 2. And this is grid column line 3. And then grid column line 4 runs along the right side of the page. And we can use those column lines to specifically position, or precisely position, specific properties. So here I've grabbed my 1 property, and I said I want my 1 property to start at grid column line 2. So that would be right here. And I want it to end at grid column line 3. And that would be right here. And I could make it wider. I could say I want it to end at grid column line 4. And then it would take up 2 columns worth of space, right? So this is a really nice property for positioning specific grid items. And just some things to note, that it does create sometimes this little empty space here where it used to be. And if you wanted to get rid of that space, then you can go back to your grid auto flow property and just add the word dense. And then other content will sort of fill in that space. So I'll just leave that there. So with the grid column property, we also have the grid row property. It does something very similar. So you can imagine that we have, when we set display grid, the browser will add grid row lines. So if you follow my mouse cursor, grid row line 1 is right here, goes across the page. Grid row line 2 is in this little gutter here. Grid row line 3, grid row line 4, and grid row line 5 right here. So I could say I want my 1 element to start at grid row line 3. So that would be right here. And then I want it to end at 5. Or let's just say 4. And so now the grid, so now you can see my grid item 1 has, first it's moved over. It starts at column 2 and it ends at column 4. And it's also moved down. It starts at grid at row 3 and ends at row 4. So, and we could grab feasibly grab every single property and manually position it using the grid column and grid row properties. I find that these properties, I don't tend to use them too much, but when I do use them, it is when I've got a layout sort of in the background. I've already got a layout sort of set up with grid template columns and grid template rows, but I've got one element that I want to precisely position on a page. So I might use the grid column and the grid row property to control where it is, and then also to make it bigger or smaller. And then just while I'm here, let's say I wanted to, let me just change this. I'll put it grid row 1, 3. Okay, so here you can see it now. The grid item 1 is quite large. Let's say I wanted to center this content in my grid item. I wanted this 1 to be right in the middle of my box, which is a very, very common thing that people, students and web designers will want to do. It's really easy with grid. All you do is you grab the grid item that it's in. So this would be .1, and you make the grid item a grid. So now we've got a grid within a grid, right? We've got our larger grid, and then we've got a smaller grid right here. And then you just use the justify content center property to center it horizontally, and then the align content center property to center it vertically. So justify content and align content are they are centering tools that only work for elements that are set to display grid, which is why I had to set display grid to this grid item. But they're so convenient, and I mean, honestly, for me, it's so much easier to do this than to try to do margin auto, or like to try. It's quite difficult sometimes to center something vertically without using these grid properties. So you can center things when you within your own. If you're using grid as a layout, you can use these properties to center things. But honestly, if you ever have something that you want to center, this is an easy way to do it. If you don't want to, if margin auto, I mean, you can always use margin auto, but if you want to center something vertically, I find that it's so much easier to do it with grid. Okay. And then the third and probably final thing that I will show you about grid is the most magical sometimes, I think. So I'm just going to get rid of this stuff. I'll keep these. I'll keep the centering properties, but what I'm going to do is use the grid area property. So grid area, I'm going to give it a value of 1. Grid area is very similar in principle to giving something a class in HTML. Basically, what we're doing is we're putting a little sticker on each of these grid items, and we're giving it a nickname that is specific to grid. So, for example, I've got my 4th paragraph here, and I'm going to give it the nickname 4. And I'm going to use this nickname in a minute to do something really cool. But you'll notice that as I give each element a nickname, it kind of disappears from the page, or it goes into the bottom right. So if you ever see something sort of stuck on the bottom right, you probably have a grid area thing happening. And you don't have to. As I type this, it can be a little tedious, but you don't have to call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can call it you know, you can call it main content, or, you know, call it something that's a little more semantic, like, you know, aside, or whatever seems appropriate for your web page. But it's going to do this for every property. 8. I wonder if I could have copy pasted it. It might have been easier. 9, and then finally 10. Okay, that was a lot of typing. Grid area. That's a lot of typing, but it has a payoff, so I'll show you. Once you've given a name to all your elements, you can go back to your grid container, and you can use the grid template areas property. And I think the best way to show this is to just sort of do it and then talk about what I just did. So I'm just going to do that. Da, 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 da. Oh, I misspelled 3 there. 4, 4. Let's do 5. 6, 7, 8. 9, 9, 8. And 10, 10, 10. Okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and make this a little bigger. There we go, so you can see it. All right, so what did I just do? First of all, I did a lot. This is a really cool property. What grid template areas does is you can create a visual representation of the layout you want in the code. So you'll see that I've got, just like I've got like this, this element, the one paragraph spanning left to right. I have it here, 1, 1, 1. And then on the second row, I've got my 2 element, and then my 3, 3. And then my third row, I've got my 2, so it goes down. It has the appearance of being like a taller element. And then 4, 5. And then 6, 7, 8. I think you should be getting the point here. 9, 9, 8, and then 10 at the bottom. So the number of inputs you put here, it determines how many columns you have. So here I've got 3 inputs, so I'm going to be giving it 3 columns. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and take out the grid template columns property just temporarily to demonstrate this a little more. So you can see now the columns are equal. Yeah, each value here is a column, and whatever name you put into the column should correspond to the nickname you gave to your elements in the grid area property. So I've given this element a grid area nickname of 1, and I can use that nickname in the grid template areas property. That's why I went and gave every element a nickname, so I can use it here. So this is a really cool way to use grid, and some people think, I mean, I think it's just very easy. Like, you want to create a layout? Well, here you go. It's you literally just create it visually in your code. Some things to note is that it can be a little finicky. So if I have 3 columns in one of my lines here, then I need 3 columns or 3 values in every single line. So if I were to add another 3 here, it would all break immediately, right? You have to make sure that you have the same number of columns in each row. Or if I were to misspell it, and, like, you know, there's nothing that has the nickname of THRE, so it breaks. If you forget a quotation mark, it breaks. So it is a little finicky, and you have to make sure you get the syntax right. So the syntax is grid template areas : and then I like to have a new line for each row. You don't have to. The computer could read this technically, but it's quite hard for humans to read. So I like to have a new line for each row, and each row is surrounded in quotation marks. And you'll note that there is no semicolon after each row, but there is a semicolon at the end of it all. So that's the syntax, or the grammar of it. Excuse me. So yeah, grid template areas, I think, is just very cool. It's a very useful property. And so if you just wanted to do a quick layout and throw something on the page real quick, use grid template areas. It's so easy. Okay, I think that's it for properties. Let me think. There are some final notes that I want to make sure that I share, because I do see some people get confused. And that first thing is that you remember you need a parent container, a parent element, sorry, that is the grid container. It doesn't have to be called a grid container. That's just what I called it because it made sense. But you need a parent element that is set to display grid, and then every child of that element is going to be a grid item, right? So, and it only works for children. So if I were to have, it does not work for grandchildren. So if I were to have like a main, wrap this paragraph 1 in a main, this paragraph is no longer a grid item because it is now a grandchild instead of a child of the grid container. So all this stuff that I'm doing here, it wouldn't, like this sort of grid area 1, since it's no longer a grid item, it won't work. Like you'll see, like I told it to be 3 columns wide, but it's not 3 columns wide anymore because it's not a grid item. If I were to change this to main, which is, that doesn't quite work. But I mean, the point is that something that I often see students get confused on is they will be trying to treat grandchildren as grid items, but they're not grid items. So you have to remember that. So let's go ahead and take out the main wrapper. Let's see. The second point that I want to make is that when you are building a web page with grid, in practice, you will not make something like this where it's so abstract. Like I just have boxes with like background colors. In practice, I think you should get into a habit, if you're not already doing this, of looking at a page and then chunking it in your head in boxes, right? So like take a page and then you see a bunch of elements are sort of grouped together. That is a box. And so in practice, what you'll be doing with grid is you will be creating not grid items that are just paragraphs, but rather grid items that are boxes. So like I might have, let's see if I'm just going to ruin all my stuff and just sort of demonstrate this. I might have 3 grid items and a side, and a main. Let me just go type this out. I like to manually type my code rather than have it autocomplete. And then maybe like a second aside. Okay. So I'll have these, my grid items are containers rather than just the P element themselves. And that allows me then to add like all kinds of stuff. Like, first of all, I might make it a little neater. I might do something like this. But I can add like a header. Hello. Like so, right? So the idea is that instead of each grid item being a paragraph or being an image, I like to think of, when I'm making a layout with grid, I like to think of my grid items as wrappers, and then I can put a bunch of stuff in that wrapper. Like it's a box that I can put things into, right? And I think that makes it easier in my head to organize a layout, and it makes it, I think it makes it easier because I start to see web pages as just clusters of boxes that have been organized, usually with like grid or something. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Hopefully this video was useful. We learned about the display grid property, grid template rows, grid template columns. We learned about grid gap. We learned about grid auto rows. We learned about using the grid column and grid row properties to position specific elements. We learned about how to take something and center it vertically and horizontally with grid. And we learned about the really cool grid template areas property that lets us create a visual representation of our layout in our code. Okay, so that's it. Hopefully this video was useful to you. And